Welcome to the Making Space podcast. We're here again with another episode on just a great subject. Have you found this? That you connect with a space before you connect with anything else. I mean, you walk into a restaurant, a building, a mall, and the physical expression speaks to you. Well, the goal of this podcast is to help you as a leader see the influence that physical spaces, both within our church buildings and outside of those church spaces, can have on the formation of our emotions, thoughts, and behavior. I'm Benjamin Windle, and I get to co-host this podcast with the amazing Jay Kim. Jay, how are you?
I'm great, Benjamin. Amazing. That is, thank you for that kind word. You know, I was actually just thinking about you and our podcast. Just recently, our church had some baptisms at the beach, about 30 minutes south of here. And I was just mesmerized by the environment and thinking about how much the environment, the space, you know, the water before us, the warm sand beneath our feet, the fresh air, how much it influenced and impacted our experience. And so, man, I've loved our conversation so far and love the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah. Where did you get baptized?
Well, I got baptized in a dirty little pool in the mountains in a youth camp.
That's what I was thinking, man. So just hearing you describe the beach and the sand under your feet, I want to get baptized all over again. But it's true, Jay, like once you start talking about place and spaces, it does open your eyes. I mean, to your point, I've been thinking just about scripture and some of the physicality that we read, like Solomon's temple, the garden, the ark, the upper room. You kind of think about these spaces that form pretty important parts of our theology and how much those spaces kind of speak to us. So yeah, man, I'm so looking forward to our conversation in this episode.
Yeah. And we're so grateful for everybody listening. Thank you guys so much for continuing to be a part of this journey with us. As you already know, if you've been a part of the podcast for a little while, you know, this podcast is a small part of a much larger project. And our hope, again, is to help you as leaders and church leaders think about how space forms us and forms our people. And in this first season, we're trying to deep dive into the idea specifically of making space for welcome and how the environments we try to craft and curate might help our people feel really welcome. And before we get into our conversation today, we want to remind you this, again, the podcast is a part of a much larger project, and we've got a journal available for you. I know many of you have already begun checking that out, but you can go to barna.com/making space. If you're a Barna Access Plus subscriber, then you've got immediate access as well. And today's conversation is going to help us think through the intersection of space and community and how the lines can get blurred between the church and the communities in which we find ourselves. So, Benjamin, tell us a little bit about our guest today.
We have Reverend Darryl Answer with us today, and he is the founding and lead pastor of New Community Church, a recent church plant in Kansas City. And actually, one of our Barna team, Joe, shout out, I've heard great things about Kansas City. I keep hearing about Kansas City. So Reverend Darryl has started a church here in Kansas City, and he has served in a variety of leadership roles within the church, nonprofit organizations, community development, alleviating poverty, racial reconciliation, and more. Darryl and his wife, Stephanie, live in Kansas City with their 2 children, Jaden and Cayenne. And Darryl, we were just hearing, you also do business as well. Tell us just a bit about the business before we jump into our conversation today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm honored to be here. The business I started actually in the pandemic, a great time to begin a business. My company is called Verge Solutions, and the focus is training and consulting in the areas of asset-based community development. So any organization, nonprofit, faith-based, or even neighborhood group. A couple of nights ago, I was presenting to a group of neighborhood leaders on asset-based community development. I just come alongside, support, and train, and help folks to make that shift to more of an asset-based approach.
Okay. Well, I'm just trying to pick your accent, Darryl. For me, just to make sure we prioritize this correctly,
Right.
I have what's known as the heavenly accent, which is the accent we all receive when we go to heaven, the Australian accent.
Yeah.
Yours isn't as good as that, but it's pretty good. What accent are you carrying there?
Yeah, so I've been here in the States for 17 years, but I was born in London. South London is where I'm from. My family's Jamaican.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I got a mashup of, so depending on where I go, people are like, man, you sound I went to London a few months ago and my family's like, man, you sound American. But when I'm here, people, exactly what you just did, like, where are you from? Because you're not from around here.
Yeah, international man of mystery. I like it. Well, just tell us a little bit about starting your church.
Yeah.
When did you start it? Tell us just a little bit about the neighborhood you've started it in. Why did you start it?
Yeah, so when I usually tell the story of New Community, I have to go back to 2010 when I moved to Kansas City. I joined at the time we were friends, but now my wife, she for the past it's over 20 years now, she's been involved in ministry in the urban core. So I moved here, and we both were a part of the same youth ministry. Was a youth development ministry in the urban core of Kansas City. And one night we were having a conversation with a group of teenagers, and I had introduced a series of lessons on the life of Christ, and we were having a conversation, just kind of just figuring out, just gauging where they were with the content, with Jesus. And a lot of these teenagers at the time were battling a lot of challenges that you will experience in an urban core environment, lower income community, and where there's violence and various things. And all of these teenagers this night said, when we believe in Jesus, if Jesus came back, he'd be in the hood with us. But we don't think we can follow him and live in this neighborhood. Right. And it was just really, that conversation was really jarring to me. That they believed in Jesus. They believed, from reading the New Testament, they believed if Jesus came back, he'd be in the hood. Right. That's as they read the scripture, they're like, yeah, he'd be with us. But to actually follow him, right? So that led, at the time, my friend Stephanie, and then eventually we started dating and we got married. There was this question we asked ourselves: what would it look like for us to live in a neighborhood, follow Jesus, and invite folks into discipleship and just see what the Spirit does? At the time, I didn't know what church planting was. I'd never heard of it. Wasn't really aware of, that there was a movement to plant church. I really didn't know. But got connected with a group, did a residency, and in 2012, we started joining different events in the community, different groups, neighborhood association, after we got married. And then we just really started building community. And in 2016, started inviting neighbors into our home for discipleship. And that was the beginning of New Community Church. But I would say before that, we functioned as the church, right, or as disciples, and then we saw this church emerge in our living room in 2016. So that's how New Community Church began, and now we exist as a network of 6 spiritual families on the east side of Kansas City. So we meet all in person once a month, but the other weeks of the month we're in houses across the east side.
What you just said there, and you kind of said it in passing, but it's such a key part of so many beautiful church planting stories. You said you invited neighbors into your home, and from there, it gave birth to this beautiful church community that now exists all over the city. And I know that for New Community, one of the things that really stands out for your church is the fact that sort of planting ethos of inviting neighbors, inviting others in, and then also going out, has sort of sustained as the church has grown over time. It's interesting, Barna, in the research that they've done along with Aspen, they found that half of all self-identified Christians strongly agree that churches have a responsibility to care for the communities that they're in. And it's in some ways, it's a really sobering reminder, because I think many of our churches maybe struggle, maybe even just totally fail in that regard. So I want to ask you specifically with New Community, what has it looked like for you and your church to care for your community? What does that actually look like practically for your church?
Yeah, going back to when we first started just being a part of our neighborhood first. Well, actually, I would say first of all, for us, we have a belief that there was already good here, so we joined what was already happening. We didn't come in with this idea that everything here was wrong and broken and the people were wicked, so we had to come in and save them. Right? It was like, no, there's good here, so we joined. So then from that, we helped to bring people together. This was before we officially became a church. We had meals together. We celebrated people's side hustles. We'd bring together like 100 folks from the east side, pay folks to use their gifts and be a blessing. We started doing prayer walks. We were starting to see violence, especially amongst our young people. So we would go to those places and we prayer walk. We'd come alongside schools in the community. At the beginning of the school year, we'd meet at schools and join with the administration and teachers and pray around the school. We've also started a revolving loan fund where we provide, we do benevolence. And actually, as a church, most of our money goes out to the community. But on top of benevolence and supporting entrepreneurs, we also started a 0% interest revolving loan fund where we're able to give folks money and to help them out. And then over a year or so, they pay us back. And then another thing we just launched in this summer is Eastside University, where I have 12 kids from the community in my home, and I train them in organizing. And we go out and we discover the gifts of neighbors in our community. And the idea is that we discover, connect, and celebrate the gifts of our neighbors. And we are changing the narrative by doing that and turning our community into a living classroom. So that's what we're doing with our kids. So those are some of the things we do. And I know more will come now that we've created these, 5 other spiritual families.
I would assume, based on even the way you're telling the story, that this has been well received by your community and your neighbors. You really are embodying what it means to create space for welcome. And that first piece you said, you knew there is already good here and we're joining, rather than going in as sort of the savior. Talk about that as you've kind of entered into that space and created welcoming space with that posture of humility, but also celebration. There's good here. We want to connect it, discover it, connect it, and celebrate it. How has that approach been received by the neighborhoods and the communities that you all are serving?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for the most part, it's been received well, especially by those who have been on the margins, those who haven't been in positions of leadership, those who haven't had as much power, or are not as connected to those with power institutions that have power and resources. So yeah, I would say well received, and I think it begins with us truly believing that every single person we encounter is made in the image of God, which means that every single person has something to contribute to the community. So nobody's left out. There aren't blocks that we're not going to go on because there's violent crime. Where we've seen resistance is from folks who feel threatened. And it's not interesting. It's not necessarily people who are doing bad things. It's folks who want to maintain the status quo. So they sometimes have a hard time with what we're doing. Like literally just today, my wife was in a meeting with a group of folks who focus on violence prevention. and they told us not to have our kids go out in the neighborhood. And my wife was like, well, this is what we do now. These kids live here, so why wouldn't they go out? So yeah, just beginning with the image of God, like everyone's an image bearer. I remember one Sunday, one of the guys who's a part of our church, he was like, man, the only reason why I come to this church is because I know I'll see you all throughout the week. Like we'll see each other, so like this is family. So we worship together, but we're also like our kids are growing up together. We've started various initiatives in the community together. So there's organizing. So it's a holistic approach to ministry that we've taken, and for the most part, we've been embraced and cared for.
Yeah, Darryl, you mentioned. I'm just curious. I don't want your attendance number of your church. I want a percentage. Okay, but when you said you meet together once a month, and then you're in homes the other 3, I'm just curious. Like, what percentage would you have of your Sunday attendance that would then meet throughout on those other 3 weeks?
Yeah, like most of them are.
Most of them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just a really interesting model. I love hearing about innovative and new ways of doing things. When Barna asked people who the church belongs to, not necessarily in a financial or legal sense, but who the church belongs to, half of self-identified Christians believe the church belongs to the community it serves. So, like, when you hear that, what does that speak to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, this may be, I don't know, like I feel like there's more nuance to it. Like for us, we don't ever separate the community from the church. So as we've talked about new community, we've said new community is woven into the fabric of our community. They're like this, So it's not that the community owns us or anything like this. Like, no, it's the same. So we're a part of this ecosystem that is our community. But I do get the understanding of like ownership. I get that, but I mean, yeah, I've never. And this is something that sometimes has gotten me in trouble, because I have never separated church from the community, even in London before I moved out here to the States. And there was always be friction with that in my congregation, because I was always like, well, this is great that we're in here singing these songs and talking about Jesus, but most of when I read about Jesus, he was outside. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah.
So how do you think then, Darryl, we break down the walls between the church and the community? Maybe not specifically your church, but I mean, if you're speaking to pastors and church leaders and leaders of all different kinds of organizations and businesses and companies, but just think about that, that one point where I guess it's something that I think is common. That sense of separation, if you're in the community from the church. How do we break down the walls between church and even literally and physically the space, our physical places, our physical facilities and buildings, so that one spills into the other?
Yeah, I mean, you could say the pandemic was an opportunity to practice. So what we did, like during the pandemic, once we were able to get out of quarantine, we met in backyards, front porches. We baptized folks in parking lots. I have a horse trough in my backyard, right? So I borrow a truck and we just roll around. We did baptisms in the neighborhood, baptisms in my backyard. So the church was everywhere, right? And I would tell our people, we may be in lockdown, we may be quarantined, but the Spirit of God isn't. The church ain't closed. You know what I'm saying? So that's just the culture and community that we've created. I've commissioned folks on my front porch, lay hands on them and pray over them and say, no, you are sent, right? And they go to work and they go be on mission while they're at work, So there's that. I think the challenge that we have as the church in general is the tools that we've been handed and the models that we've been given. So even when we talk about church planting, for the longest time, I struggled because people didn't think what we were doing was actually a church. People would say, "Are you a missionary or are you a church planter?" And I didn't understand what they were talking about, right? But what I eventually found out was when they asked that question, to be a church planter means you are launching a Sunday service. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the focus. And you have to get some kind of a space. And, we never had that. Like, we meet at the YMCA once a month. Other than that, we're in homes. The only reason why we were in a building before that was because the director of an organization gave me the keys to the building and said, you use it whenever you want. We have never had enough money to rent a place. So it has forced us to be innovative, and it has forced us to reimagine. And we talk about that a lot. Reimagining the church. We have full permission because there's no one coming at us and telling us we have to be a certain size. We have to look a certain way. Yes, we're connected and part of a denomination, but like, they leave us alone, So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's actually really profound, Darryl. I want to ask you, on behalf of many church leaders who are listening right now, if they're like me, and I think they're probably something like me, they are utterly inspired by what you're sharing and the vision of what the church can be in a particular neighborhood and city, and this vision that your church and new community is living out and embodying. And the beauty of the fact that you're gathering in homes, you've completely blurred the lines, or maybe even erased the lines between what in sort of modern American culture we think of as personal space. Like, my home is for me and it's a respite for me and a select few that I love and care about. And then church is that place I go to and I put on my church face or whatever, and I have a nice little experience and then I come back. You're being the church in the most personal of spaces, and you're doing that in multiple personal spaces. So talk a little bit to the church leader, and that's the majority of church leaders listening, who serves at or leads or is a part of a church community that has a building. They rent a space. And for the most part, we think of that as a great advantage. And there are advantages to that.
Absolutely.
But you're sort of highlighting for us maybe a potential disadvantage in that it pushes us to create these demarcating lines between our personal spaces and our lives, and then like the four walls of a church building. And I have, a compartmentalized sort of view of church and then my own life and all those things. Talk to us, as we serve and lead in churches that maybe have buildings. What are some things we can do? How can we begin slowly eliminating the barriers that naturally exist when our churches and the people, our congregations, think of church much more in the classic, traditional Western American way? The church is a place I go. Teach us a little bit from your experience, where for you in new community, church is not a place you go. Church is a home you belong to, and it's several homes, and you share meals and break bread, and you see them Monday to Saturday, and then on Sunday too.
Yeah.
Talk to the leader who sort of lives in that more traditional model, and how we might begin eliminating some of those barriers.
Yeah, I mean, we're steeped in hundreds of years of this type of church, right? But I think some simple things that leaders can do is change language. Like in our churches, we're structured organizationally, and then even just the way our buildings are structured, like it props up hierarchies. So there's the pastor, there's the clergy. They're the ones, even though we won't say this, but they're the ones who are closest to God, right? They know the will of God, or they know, like they come and they teach us. And there's some truth to that. But I think if we move from hierarchy to, and this is asset-based community development, this is my world, is like moving from triangles to circles, right? Like if we start talking more about family and start figuring out how do we function in this space as a family, and then recognize, and I think our native sisters and brothers can help us with this. How do we then recognize that we are then connected to a broader family in this geographic location, right? That the walls of this building are not a barricade to keep us safe, right? But this building can be used as a blessing to bless our other siblings in this community, right? So where are the entrepreneurs out there that need a space? Do you have a huge kitchen in your building and you can use that kitchen for someone who wants to start a catering business? You have space in your building for folks who want to throw birthday parties and there's nowhere in the community to do that. Could you open your space up, right? Could your building become an incubator for the community? So I think language and then the practical usage of that space could really begin to move in a different direction. But I know that rubs against current models and mindsets, so it'll be really difficult. But I think, it's at least where I'm at, like people are hungry for that.
Yeah, that's so good.
That's fantastic. I'm taking so much of this in, Darryl. It's so helpful. Would you have any final words of encouragement? I mean, just learning about your model and your innovative thinking, as Jay said, I think it's inspiring for leaders. It's inspiring for pastors. Would you have any final words of encouragement for listeners today?
Yeah, I would just say, and this is something that I have to keep going back to, is that Jesus is still doing something. Right? Jesus is in our communities. You may be in your building, you may be frustrated. Be frustrated with the way things are, the status quo, or even folks who are part of your spiritual family that are trying to maintain the status quo. But the good news is that Jesus is still up to something. The Spirit is still up to something. So even though you're doing that hard work of, maintaining what is, may God open your eyes to what could be. And maybe we find ourselves in that tension, right? Because I do believe beautiful things happen in tension. The either or, I don't know about that, but I know for me, when I found myself in these places of tension is where I've seen the Spirit of God do crazy things. So that's my prayer and my hope for your listeners.
Yeah. Yeah. Darryl, thank you so much for what you're doing, the example you're setting, and the innovation that you're pushing forward for the church. And thanks for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Benjamin, there was so much there. I loved when Darryl was talking about seeing and recognizing the Imago Dei, living with that sort of generous assumption as we delve into and lean into these communities that maybe from the outside in, looking in, seem like they're struggling or there's trouble there, to assume that there's good there, and to discover that good. That was one of the things that stood out for me. There's so much good in that conversation. What were some of the highlights or provocative moments for you?
Yeah, it's a fresh perspective that Darryl brought, and I think it's helpful. I think no matter what context you're pastoring in or what model you're in, hearing about not just different approaches, but the why behind the what, it can stimulate innovation that can still take place within your existing context. It may not look the same or be expressed the same, but I think it can open up some great questions, particularly around community engagement. I love what Darryl said in terms of they really see their church interwoven within the ecosystem of their local community. And I think intrinsic within that is they're helping break down those barriers. And so there's a lot to take away from that conversation. What about yourself?
Yeah, I like what you said just a moment ago, that, these sorts of conversations and hearing the why behind it helps us. The goal is not to map on what somebody else or another church is doing and just say, well, that's the formula, let's do that. The real goal is to excavate the why and then ask that same why question in our own context. Well, why do we do what we do? Why don't we do some of the things we don't do? So as a church leader, as someone who loves the local church and serves in the local church today, those are some of the questions. That's how some of the gears are running sort of in my mind right now. I especially appreciated that thought about how we leverage and use and open up our space, 7 days a week to the community. And that's a question we're asking quite a bit here. And there's all sorts of complexities with that too, liability issues and insurance, and you've got to work some of those things out. And because of that, there are limitations, but at least pushing in that direction, pushing the limits and asking, how can we blur the lines? How can our physical space become a communal physical space? Where we discover the good in our city and in our neighborhoods. I think that's a fascinating and inspiring thought.
Correct. Anything we can do as pastors or leaders that helps see the community in the way that Darryl described it.
Yeah.
These are not two separate worlds. How can we be interwoven into the fabric of this neighborhood, this context, this city, this region in which we're ministering in, I think is super helpful. So a quick reminder to all of our listeners, if you would like to learn more, make sure you check out the Making Space Journal series. Journal 1, which is titled Making Space for Innovation, is live now. So if you want to order it, please go to barna.com/making space, or you can subscribe to the Barna Access Plus portal to get immediate access to this journal and the future ones as they release. So thank you to our listening leaders. We're a new podcast, so if you've been encouraged, learned something today, wow, it would mean so much if you could leave a rating, share it with a friend, leave a review, and we will catch you next time on the Making Space podcast.